The diner smelled of burnt coffee and fryer grease, a heavy haze clinging to the cracked vinyl booths. Outside, Chicago's winter clawed at the windows, frosting the edges of the glass with delicate, jagged patterns. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the handful of late-night patrons. Maria Delgado wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric stained with ketchup and coffee rings. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, strands escaping to frame her tired face. At 32, she carried the weight of too many double shifts, too many bills, and a stubborn hope that refused to die. She moved with practiced efficiency, balancing a tray of plates while dodging a toddler who'd escaped his high chair. The diner, Rosie's all-night eatery, was a relic of better days, its faded checkered floor and jukebox stuck on Sinatra tracks a testament to a world that no longer existed. Maria had worked here for 6 years, ever since her husband Carlos left her with a toddler and a pile of debt. Her son Mateo was 8 now, asleep in the back room on a cot she'd set up near the stock shelves. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than leaving him alone in their drafty apartment. "Order." "Up," called Jimmy, the cook, sliding a plate of pancakes across the pass-through. Maria flashed him a quick smile, her eyes crinkling despite the ache in her legs. She delivered the plate to a trucker in a flannel shirt, his beard flecked with crumbs. "Anything else I can get you?" she asked, her voice warm but frayed at the edges. "Nah, darlin', I'm good," he said, barely looking up from his phone. Maria's gaze drifted to the corner booth where a man and a boy sat. The man was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with sharp features and a tailored coat that screamed money. His dark hair was streaked with silver, and his eyes, cold, calculating, scanned the room like he was sizing up a battlefield. The boy, no older than 10, had the same sharp jawline but softer eyes, wide and curious. He wore a navy blazer that looked too big for his slight frame, and his tie was loosened, hanging crookedly. The man was typing furiously on a sleek laptop, ignoring the boy who poked at a plate of untouched fries. Maria approached, her notepad ready. "Evening, folks. Can I get you anything else?" The man didn't look up. "Coffee. Black." The boy glanced at her, his expression hesitant. "Can I have a milkshake, chocolate?" "Sure thing, kiddo," Maria said, scribbling the order. She noticed the boy's hands fidgeting, his fingers twisting the edge of the tablecloth. "You want whipped cream on that?" He nodded, a small smile breaking through. "Yeah, lots." "Coming right up." Maria turned to leave, but the man's voice cut through the air. "Evan, you don't need a milkshake, you barely touched your food." The boy, Evan, shrunk into the booth, his smile vanishing. "I'm not hungry for fries," he mumbled. "Then, you're not hungry for a milkshake," the man said, his tone final. He resumed typing, the clack of keys like gunfire in the quiet diner. Maria hesitated, her pen hovering over her notepad. She'd seen this before. Parents too busy, too distracted, too cold. It stung in a way that reached deep, tugging at memories of her own childhood, of nights spent waiting for her father to notice her. She forced a smile and headed to the counter, but Evan's defeated expression lingered in her mind. Behind the counter, she poured the man's coffee and started on the milkshake. The blender whirred, a low rumble that drowned out the jukebox's crooning. She glanced at the back room, where Mateo slept, his small chest rising and falling under a worn blanket. Her heart tightened. She'd do anything for him, anything to keep him safe, fed, loved. She added an extra scoop of ice cream to the milkshake, topped it with a generous swirl of whipped cream, and grabbed a cherry from the jar. When she returned to the booth, she set the coffee in front of the man, who barely acknowledged her, and slid the milkshake toward Evan. His eyes lit up, but he glanced at his father, uncertain. "Go ahead," Maria whispered, winking. "I won't tell." Evan's grin was worth every risk. He took a sip, the straw squeaking against the glass, and for a moment he looked like any other kid, carefree, happy. Maria's chest warmed, a fleeting reprieve from the exhaustion that clung to her bones. The man, whose name Maria would later learn, was Richard Caldwell, finally looked up, his gaze narrowing. "I said no milkshake." Maria froze, her pulse quickening. "It's on the house," she said quickly. "Just a little treat for him, he looked like he could use it." Richard's eyes flicked to Evan, then back to Maria. His expression was unreadable, a mix of irritation and something else. Curiosity, maybe. "You don't get to decide what my son needs," he said, his voice low, controlled. "I'm sorry," Maria said, her throat tight. "I just thought, don't think, do your job." He turned back to his laptop, dismissing her. Maria's cheeks burned as she walked away, her hands trembling. She busied herself wiping down the counter, but the sting of his words lingered. She'd overstepped and she couldn't afford to lose this job. Not with rent due, not with Mateo's school supplies piling up. She stole a glance at Evan, who was sipping the milkshake quietly, his eyes fixed on the table. Guilt twisted in her gut. She'd wanted to make him smile, but maybe she'd only made things worse. The night dragged on. The trucker left, dropping a crumpled 10 on the table. A couple of college kids stumbled in, giggling and reeking of cheap beer. Maria served them burgers and cokes, her movements mechanical. Every so often she checked on Mateo, brushing his hair back from his forehead. He stirred once, murmuring something about dinosaurs, and she smiled despite herself. Around midnight, the diner was nearly empty. Richard was still in the corner booth, his laptop glowing, his coffee untouched. Evan had fallen asleep, his head resting on his arms, the empty milkshake glass beside him. Maria was sweeping the floor when she heard a soft thud. She turned to see Evan's blazer slip off the booth, revealing a small notebook that had fallen to the floor. She hesitated, then picked it up. The cover was worn, the pages filled with childish drawings, spaceships, dragons, a stick figure family with a man, a boy, and a woman who wasn't there. Tucked between the pages was a photo of Evan and a woman with warm brown eyes and a radiant smile. The back read, "Mom and Me 2022. Maria's heart sank. She knew that look, that absence. She'd seen it in Mateo's eyes when he asked about his father. She slipped the notebook back into the blazer and hung it on the booth's hook. As she did, Richard's voice startled her. "What are you doing?" Maria flinched, turning to face him. "It fell," she said, holding up her hands. "I was just putting it back." His eyes narrowed, searching her face. "You went through his things?" "No, She stopped, realizing how it looked. "It fell open. I saw a photo. I'm sorry." Richard stood, his presence towering despite his average height. He stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't touch my son's things. You don't give him milkshakes. You don't insert yourself into our lives, understand?" Maria nodded, her mouth dry. "Yes, sir." He stared at her for a moment longer, then grabbed the blazer and notebook, tucking them under his arm. He shook Evan awake, his movements brisk. "Let's go." Evan blinked, disoriented, and followed his father out into the cold. The bell above the door jangled and they were gone. Maria stood frozen, her broom still in hand. The diner felt emptier, the air heavier. She'd messed up, and the weight of it pressed against her chest. She finished her shift in silence, the hum of the jukebox her only company. The next night, Maria was back at Rosie's, her apron tied a little tighter, her smile a little forced. She hadn't slept well, her dreams haunted by Richard's cold stare and Evan's fleeting smile. Mateo was in the back again, his crayons scattered across a coloring book. She checked on him every chance she got, her anxiety spiking with every creak of the diner's door. Around 9, the bell jangled and Richard walked in. Alone. Maria's stomach dropped. She busied herself refilling salt shakers, hoping he'd sit somewhere else, but he slid into the same corner booth, his laptop under his arm. He looked different tonight, less polished, his tie gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up. His eyes found her and he raised a hand, beckoning her over. She approached cautiously, her notepad a shield. "Evening. Coffee again?" He studied her, his expression softer but still unreadable. "What's your name?" "Maria," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her chest. "Maria," he repeated, as if testing the word. "Last night you gave my son a milkshake." "Why?" She swallowed, choosing her words carefully. "He looked sad. I thought it might cheer him up." "And you thought you had the right to make that call?" Her cheeks flushed, but she held his gaze. "I didn't mean any harm, I know what it's like to feel invisible." Richard leaned back, his fingers drumming on the table. "You don't know anything about us." "I know he's a kid," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And kids need to know someone sees them." For a moment, neither spoke. The diner's sounds, clinking dishes, Jimmy's radio, the hum of the fridge, filled the silence. Then, Richard did something unexpected. He laughed. It was short, bitter, but it cracked the tension like a hammer on ice. "You're bold," he said. "Stupid maybe, but bold." Maria didn't know whether to be insulted or relieved. "I'll get your coffee," she said, turning to leave. "Wait," he said. She stopped, bracing herself. "Evan talked about you all day. The waitress who gave him a milkshake, he said you were nice." Her heart stuttered. "He's a sweet kid." "He is," Richard said, his voice softening. "He's all I have left." Maria nodded, sensing the weight behind his words. "I'm sorry about his mom." Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't snap at her. Instead, he looked away, his gaze fixed on the frosted window. "She died 2 years ago. Cancer. Evan hasn't been the same since." "I'm so sorry," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. She thought of the photo, of Evan's drawings, of the empty space in his life. Richard cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "I'm not good at this. Being a father. I'm trying, but I'm failing him." The admission hung between them, raw and unguarded. Maria saw it then, the crack in his armor, the fear beneath the cold exterior. She wanted to say something to offer comfort, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, she said, "He loves you. I saw it in the way he looks at you." Richard's eyes met hers, and for the first time they weren't cold. "You're a mother," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah. My son, Mateo. He's 8. "Where is he?" "In the back. I don't have anyone to watch him at night." Richard nodded, his expression unreadable again. "That's why you work here, to take care of him." "Everything I do is for him," she said, her voice fierce despite its softness. He studied her, as if seeing her for the first time. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. "I'm Richard Caldwell. I own a few companies. If you ever need a job, a real one, call me." Maria stared at the card, her fingers hovering over it. The embossed letters gleamed under the fluorescent light, promising a world she'd never dared to imagine. She wanted to believe it was genuine, but years of disappointment had taught her caution. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you saw my son," he said simply. "Not many people do." She took the card, her hands trembling. "Thank you." He nodded, then opened his laptop, signaling the conversation was over. Maria slipped the card into her apron and went to fetch his coffee, her mind racing. Was this a lifeline or a trap? She didn't know, but for the first time in years, she felt a spark of possibility. Over the next week, Richard became a regular. He came alone at first, then started bringing Evan. Maria learned their rhythm, Richard's curt orders, Evan's shy smiles. The way they sat in silence but craved each other's presence. She kept her distance, wary of crossing another line, but Evan sought her out, asking about Mateo, showing her his drawings. One night, he gave her a sketch of a dragon, its scales meticulously shaded with crayon. "For you," he said, his cheeks pink. Maria's throat tightened. "It's beautiful, Evan. I'll keep it forever." Richard watched from the booth, his expression softer each time. Maria began to see the man beneath the billionaire, the one who carried his own grief, who loved his son but didn't know how to show it. She saw herself too in his struggle, the fear of failing the one person who mattered most. One night, everything changed. It was a brutal February evening, the wind howling like a wounded animal. The diner was quiet, the jukebox broken, the air thick with the scent of onions and desperation. Maria was behind the counter when the door burst open, and a man in a ski mask stormed in, a gun gleaming in his hand. "Empty the register," he shouted, his voice ragged. "Now!" Maria's heart stopped. She raised her hands, her eyes darting to the back room where Mateo slept. Okay, she said, her voice shaking. "Just stay calm." Jimmy froze at the grill, his spatula clattering to the floor. The few patrons, Richard, Evan, and an elderly couple, stiffened in their seats. The gunman swung his weapon toward them. "Nobody moves." Maria opened the register, her fingers fumbling with the bills. Her pulse pounded in her ears, every second stretching into eternity. She thought of Mateo, of his sleepy smile, of the life she'd promised him. She couldn't lose him, she wouldn't. "Hurry up," the gunman barked, stepping closer. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, his hands trembling. He was desperate, and that made him dangerous. Maria shoved the cash into a bag, her movements deliberate to buy time. "Here," she said, holding it out. "Take it and go." The gunman snatched the bag, but his gaze darted to the back room. "What's back there?" "Nothing," Maria said too quickly. "Just storage." He took a step toward the door, and Maria's blood ran cold. "No," she shouted, moving to block him. "There's nothing there." The gunman raised the gun, his finger twitching on the trigger. "Get out of my way." Before Maria could react, Richard was on his feet, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You want money? I've got more than you can carry." The gunman turned, his gun now aimed at Richard. "Sit down, rich boy." "I'm Richard Caldwell," he said, his tone calm, commanding. "I can wire you $1 million right now. Let her go." Maria's breath caught. She saw Evan, wide-eyed and trembling, clutching the table. She wanted to scream at Richard to stop, to not risk himself, but her voice wouldn't come. The gunman laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "You think I'm stupid? You're bluffing." "Test me," Richard said, pulling out his phone. "Give me an account number. You'll have the money in 10 minutes. The gunman hesitated, his gun wavering. Maria saw her chance. She grabbed a coffee pot from the counter and swung it with all her strength, smashing it against the gunman's head. He staggered, the gun clattering to the floor. Richard lunged, tackling him, pinning him down as Jimmy ran to help. Maria scrambled for the gun, her hands shaking as she kicked it away. The elderly couple called 911, their voices trembling. Evan was crying, his small body curled into the booth. Maria ran to him, pulling him into her arms. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered, her own tears falling. "You're safe." Police arrived minutes later, cuffing the gunman and taking statements. Maria's legs gave out and she sank to the floor, Evan still clinging to her. Richard knelt beside them, his face pale, his hands bruised from the struggle. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough. Maria nodded, unable to speak. She looked at Evan, at Richard, at the diner that had nearly become her grave. And then she thought of Mateo, still asleep, unaware of how close he'd come to losing her. The aftermath was a blur. Police reports, paramedics, the diner closing early. Richard stayed, refusing to leave until Maria was cleared to go home. He drove her and Mateo to their apartment, a cramped one-bedroom with peeling paint and a leaky faucet. Mateo, groggy but curious, stared at Richard like he was a superhero. Inside, Maria made hot chocolate, her hands still trembling. Richard sat at her wobbly kitchen table, Evan asleep on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. The silence was heavy, charged with everything they hadn't said. "You saved us," Maria said finally, her voice barely audible. "You saved yourself," Richard replied. "And my son." She shook her head, tears welling. "I was so scared. For Mateo, for Evan, for you." Richard reached across the table, his hand covering hers. It was warm, steady, and for the first time Maria saw the man he could be. Not the billionaire, not the grieving widower, but the father, the protector, the human. "You're not alone anymore," he said. The words broke something in her, a dam she'd built around her heart. She cried then, for the years of struggle, for the fear, for the hope she'd clung to despite everything. Richard didn't pull away. He stayed, his presence a quiet promise. The next morning, Maria woke to find an envelope slipped under her, shorter. Inside was a check for $50,000, signed by Richard Caldwell, and a note, "For Mateo's future and yours." She stared at it, her breath hitching. It was more money than she'd ever seen, enough to pay off her debts, to move somewhere safe, to give Mateo the life she'd dreamed of. She called Richard, her voice trembling with gratitude and disbelief. "Why?" she asked. "Why me?" "Because you saw my son," he said again, his voice thick with emotion. "And because I see you." Maria hung up, the check clutched in her hand. She looked at Mateo, who was eating cereal at the table, his laughter filling the room. She thought of Evan, of the milkshake, of the dragon drawing, of the night that had changed everything. A single act of kindness had shattered her world, rebuilding it with hope. She framed Evan's drawing and hung it above her desk, a reminder of the boy who'd needed her and the man who'd seen her. Months later, when she and Mateo moved into a new apartment, when she started a job at one of Richard's companies, when Evan and Mateo became friends, she never forgot that night. It was a story of fear and courage, of loss and love, of a waitress who dared to care. And as she tucked Mateo into bed each night, she whispered the same words to herself, a quiet vow to the world. Kindness changes everything.